I'm Lucy, I'm from NSE, this is Chris. We're going to quickly introduce the day in the society. I'm going to read a poem, just to subvert convention, and then we'll get on with our first panel. This poem is in the programme, if you want to read it yourself. Search alternative. What alternatives are you looking for? Pushing back at the pressures knocking at the door of the home you don't own but still have to pay for. There is no plan, there is no God. It's no good looking, just do what you should. No. It's time to wake up. The connections are there. We've put on this conference for you to hear some pretty swell people and what they have to say. Nothing's going to change if we all want it our way. So open your ears, put pencil to page. We offer you a space in which to engage with the realities of life, the possibilities of new. So turn to your neighbour, educate by communicating the things you can do. To resist the impossible and find within you the God in us all, there to create. Think of your limitations and instead of surrender, dedicate. The energy this culture wants you to spend, buying more stuff and living for individual ends. Point it instead to community. Seize the opportunity for an erosion of power in neoliberal hegemony. Don't worry if you're sceptical. We're that way through nurture. NSE brings you this day for us to see if we mobilise together, could there be an alternative future?
Thank you, Lucy. So who are New School Economics? We're a student society here at Goldsmiths University. We are predominantly PPE students or graduates. So the politics, philosophy and economics degree here at Goldsmiths is sort of it was incubated by the Political Economy Research Centre, which Will and John are here are directors of. And we are also a sister of Rethinking Economics, which is a student-led organisation which campaigns for pluralism in economic teaching and to rethink how economics is taught, studied and practiced. So today is an accumulation, a culmination of around 4 or 5 events over the last year that we've put on to sort of ask questions about who the economy is for. And today is the biggest event we've done so far. We also had a conference last summer, which was very successful. Today looks like a great day. We have first up a panel called Precarity with William Davies and Phoebe Moore. We then break off into parallel sessions. So we have one panel called Austerity and Debt with Dr. Awana Parvan, Oslam Onaran, and also Jonna Montgomery. We then have Mental Health After Neoliberalism, which continues a talk that we had in January. And we have Dr. Jay Watts, Dr. Ruth Kane, and Professor Josh Cohen, which is quite an alternative panel. We don't have an economist there, but we have Lucy chairing, who's...
not an economist.
After lunch, we break for an hour after lunch, for lunch at 12:30 till 1:30. Then we have Brexit. An opportunity. So we're looking at Brexit as an opportunity to sort of mobilise these new economic futures. Well, is it an opportunity to mobilise these new economic futures? We have Professor David Bailey, Professor Natalie Fenton, and also Professor Alan Finlayson. So it's a really well-qualified panel, but also very different perspectives there. And we then another parallel session split, and we have Platform Politics and Digital Futures with Dr. Raymond Amaro, recent Dr. Raymond Amaro, recent Dr. Francesca Sabande, and Professor Jeremy Gilbert. And the other parallel session, which I need this for their names, it's called Autonomous Organising and Collective Power, an Economy for the Common Good. We have Samir Anderson, Simon Vickery, Lydia Hughes, and Lucy Gardner. And then the final keynote at 5 o'clock, ignoring the football, is Just Futures. And we have Anne Pettifor and Jason Hickle, which should be a really great discussion. And so welcome. And I'll hand over to Oh yeah, and there's a so there's a little. So yesterday we received an email saying that Guy Standing sadly can't make it today, which is very unfortunate. But the good news is that we have William Davies, who is more than qualified to take his space, and yeah, we welcome these two, William Davies, Phoebe Moore, and Sari to chair the discussion. So thank you.
Hello. Yes, thank you for coming. So I'm Sari. I'm an NSE member and soon-to-be graduate of PPE as well, hopefully. Yeah, so we're talking about precarity today. Probably quite a lot of us in this room will be experiencing precarity at the moment. It is something to do with work conditions, whether that's short-term, flexible, 0 hours, blah, 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 or housing, finance, but also kind of maybe an internal sense. So I think it's going to be great. Can I just remind everyone, turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. So we've got Dr. Phoebe Moore and Dr. William Davies here to talk about this. We're going to give 20 minutes each for the presentations, and then we'll have a good discussion of like about 35 minutes afterwards, so should be good. So yeah, we've got we're going to have Will speaking first. He is Senior Lecturer in Politics and Co-Director of PERC at Goldsmiths. He's also convener of the amazing PPE degree we've just, a lot of us are about to finish and really sad to say goodbye to. He has kind of researched on neoliberalism, history of economic thought, etc. And he's just published a book called Economic Science Fictions, which is doing really well and looks very exciting. And then we're going to have Dr. Phoebe Moore, who is wonderful to welcome here. She spoke Goldsmiths at the beginning of the year as well. She is Associate Professor of Political Economy and Technology at the University of Leicester School of Business. She's been working researching workers' struggles for the last 20 years and is at the moment researching the use of technology and quantification in the workplace. And has worked with the International Labour Organization. And last year, she has published a book called The Quantified Self in Precarity. So she knows all about this kind of stuff. So we'll start with Will. And yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sari. And thank you. I want to just first of all say what I was originally due to say. My main responsibility for the day was to sort of say hello and welcome everybody, and to say how incredibly impressed I am by the energy that the Student Society has put into organising today's event. They've done similarly impressive events in the past, and it really is quite amazing to watch the energy and intellectual drive and political passions that have been mobilised already towards this event and to previous ones. As you've just heard, Guy Standing, PA, sent us a message at about 1 o'clock yesterday saying that he wasn't going to be able to make it. And I was keen to ensure that the panel still worked in some way. And although I don't work on precarity as such, I thought that maybe I could reflect on some of the work that I've done in the past on neoliberalism and how it affects our sense of self, to reflect on a kind of broader cultural and political level on the ways in which neoliberalism undermines the possibility of a coherent self. And if there was a title for my remarks today, which I, as you can guess, put together at some haste yesterday afternoon, it would be the question which I think is shaping so much of our politics and our culture right now, which is, what can you still depend on if you fail or if you're unlucky? Which I think gets to the heart of many of the political upheavals of our present moment and many of the tensions and distresses. Now, in his extraordinary book, Sources of the Self, the philosopher Charles Taylor says that one of the key ethical features of modernity, modernity in the sense of an epoch that emerged around the 17th century and then accelerates over the 19th century, is that it requires each of us to live our lives as a story. To live our lives as a story. The distinctive literary forms of modernity are therefore the novel and the biography. Modernity might create a sense of collective indeterminacy, a sense that the human species has autonomy over its collective direction, but at the same time, because it collectivizes that sense of indeterminacy, it offers patterns of individual coherence and patterns of everyday life that allow individuals to live their lives as a coherent story on an existential, personal, private level. And what do I think this notion of living one's life as a story can mean? One way to put it into the context of contemporary precarity is that if we can live our lives as a story, we have agency in our lives, but not total responsibility for our lives. There is, at the heart of a story, a protagonist with choices and a comprehensible trajectory, but not total autonomy over their situation. So you can have a kind of comic story, you can have a tragic story, but in some sense there is an interplay between structure and agency, rather than an excessive emphasis on agency that I think, as I'll go on to say, that neoliberalism implies. Now, the era that is known as post-modernity, generally dated back to some point in the early 1970s, violates aspects of this central ethical injunction. It philosophically and psychologically, it challenges the coherence of the self. Culturally, it dismantles and deconstructs the narrative form of the novel and of the biography, and it sees, in some ways, structure and agency collapse into each other. And this is I'm going to talk about this in relation to neoliberalism and the economy. In the economic domain, the era known as neoliberalism or post-fordism, or whatever you want to call the epoch that emerged somewhere between 1968 and 1980, makes it ever harder to live one's life as a coherent story in which one is a protagonist rather than just a passive vessel being tossed around. And I think one of the things I want to throw out to this discussion today, as on a conceptual level, even someone who hasn't studied precarity, is that I think one of the central risks of precarity is that it makes one's life incomprehensible in some way. It takes away the possibility of having a coherent life story. Now, psychologically, we can see today this condition of total responsibility can also flip into a feeling of powerlessness in some way, that when one is told that one can do anything to change one's conditions, this can quickly flip into some type of depression. Actually, John Montgomery, who's here, and I wrote a report a couple of years ago called Financial Melancholia, which explored some of this in relation to problem debt. But examples of this would be that money is made available in this society in sometimes quite large quantities, but only as a risky investment that one is completely responsible for. An example of this would be student finance, very large sums of credit, but one is completely responsible for how they get used and for the outcomes of them. Welfare services remain available, but they are employed partly at re-energizing a self that has become depressed and overburdened by obligations of the marketplace. So you think of things like workfare programs that integrate positive thinking to try and get people to become re-energized, to become more entrepreneurial, more energetic in their job seeking and so on. And the previous event that I spoke at with Jay Watts and Ruth Kane back in January, organised by this society, looked a lot at some of these, the ways in which aspects of neoliberalism prey on our mental health in via these sorts of policies. Care and social security remain available, but only if it is first established that other sources of security do not exist, so that they become some kind of last resort rather than something that can be depended on. So something like the bedroom tax and other types of intrusions into the domestic realm say that, well, you are not eligible for some kind of social security or support because you have already some other kind of support that you could rely upon. So there was a kind of search for the lowest common denominator. Public spending survives against some characterizations of neoliberalism, but it becomes oriented only towards the excellent. So that would be the excellent city. Excel, incidentally, is a relativist term. It's worth remembering that the term excel means stand out. It doesn't mean good or virtuous or brilliant. It means being better than others, excel. So when university governance is oriented entirely towards excellence, that doesn't mean being a good university, it means being better than the other universities. So this is why the ranking becomes the key instrument of evaluation. Now, what I want to talk about in relation to this talk in terms of precarity is that I think what the term precarity and the idea of the precariat has done very well is to look at the various ways in the unevenness of this project, that it affects some people far more intensely than others, and others can use various forms of privilege to escape it altogether. That in many ways, the era of precarity and the era of neoliberalism and fundamental uncertainty, or post-modernity, post-fordism, is as characterized by how people escape that condition and the sources of security that they go in search of to avoid it, as it is of the success of those forms of governance. So I'm going to do sort of three things briefly. Firstly, I want to look at some of the central principles of neoliberal selfhood as they can be identified in neoliberal thought over the 20th century. And I think the key issue here is that it imagines a self that is entrepreneurial, that is amenable to constant self-reinvention, to constant adaptation, to pursue different life trajectories at the drop of a hat, to disinvest from one life story and to immediately reinvest in a different life story. It grants permanence to the system, but fundamental impermanence to any individual part of the system. So the individual roles in the system are completely contingent. The system itself is completely fixed. And in some ways, this is a kind of an inversion of that story about modernity that I was telling earlier in relation to Charles Taylor, where perhaps collectively, as a species, our future is completely indeterminate, but individually and privately we can still have coherent, meaningful stories. Secondly, I want to talk briefly about how this functions in practice, drawing particular attention to the sources of security and permanence that start to arise in a system that declares that there aren't any. And then finally, just talk a bit about the main theme of the conference, which is how do we imagine alternative economic futures, and just touch on a couple of things there. Now, so, the neoliberal self, in his lectures on neoliberalism, published as The Birth of Biopolitics, the French philosopher Michel Foucault argues that a new way of dealing with the governmental challenge of liberalism emerged in the first half of the 20th century, and which can be broadly characterized as neoliberal. This was, as Wendy Brown has argued in her book Undoing the Demos, building directly on Foucault's lectures, a new political rationality. It emerged much earlier than many people realize, as early as the 1930s or then possibly the 1920s. But I think what's important to stress about the implications of Foucault's work and Brown's work is that when we're talking about neoliberalism and its implications for personal lives and for selves, we're not just talking about an economic program of deregulation, tax cuts, rolling back the state, or some kind of regime of political economy as it came into existence in the late 1970s. That's how Marxists such as David Harvey have characterized it. It's not wrong, but there is a lot else going on besides. It's not just a class-based project as Harvey characterizes it as. Harvey would say that neoliberalism is what he calls accumulation by dispossession, with things like privatization being ways of restoring the rate of profit by seizing public assets. I don't disagree with that analysis of political economy, but what I want to talk about today is that what Brown and Foucault call the political rationality and how it impacts upon the self. What we're talking about is a mentality and a rationality that permeates society, politics, culture, and the self. And as Foucault stresses, and Philip Mirowski, the historian of economics, has detailed at some length, this isn't just about things the state shouldn't do, such as tax, regulate, protect, redistribute, but about lots of things the state should do. It involves a very active state, workfare, PFI, university auditing and ranking, new public management, nudging people towards living more active, healthy lives. There can be quite high levels of public spending in pursuit of a neoliberal program. As the Blair government demonstrated, it can see very large sums of money being put into education, but education of a certain kind that is conducive to greater return on future investment via innovation and creating an adaptable workforce. I want to just point out three aspects of this that I think are relevant to the condition of precarity that we see around us today. The first principle that I think is at stake in neoliberal thought is fundamentally a Darwinist one, which is that human beings are naturally unequal in their abilities. This is very different from the starting point of liberalism, which is that human beings all have some fundamental similarity of some kind, whether it be reason or fear of death or their capacity to labour or whatever it might be. But the starting point of neoliberalism is a Darwinist one, which is that in their natural conditions, human beings are all different by being unequal. Some are stronger than others. If you want an example of neoliberal ideology in its most naked form today, look at the words of people like Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins and others, that it is key for them that biology says we are not the same, and some of us are stronger than others, and some of us will dwindle, and some of us will thrive. So it turns qualitative difference all turns into quantitative difference, because it means that some will prosper and grow and expand, and some will dwindle and be trodden on. The challenge that the 20th century poses from a neoliberal perspective, this is the second point, is that social theorists, socialists, experts, and welfare states suppress this fundamental truth, that they seek to deny it by imposing rules, laws, policies, regimes, redistribution, welfare states, and so on, to try and suppress this fundamental truth about humanity. And this has all sorts of unintended consequences, which at their worst extreme would be the gulag, but might also involve welfare dependency, unemployment, or all these kind of things, which are all fundamentally the fault of left-wing ideas. This is the key argument that people like Hayek make and so on, is that everything that goes wrong from roughly 1930 onwards is the fault of left-wing thinking and its influence over experts and so on. And again, you see this in the work of people like Peterson and so on. So the task of neoliberalism, point 3, is to fight the political constructs of socialist intellectuals and planners with its own political constructs. They've got their regime, we need our own regime, is the view of neoliberals, and they have to do it constructively. It's not going to happen naturally. It requires a lot of effort, it requires a lot of policy pamphlets, a lot of seminars, a lot of networks, the Mont Pelerin Society, the Centre for Policy Studies, the Adam Smith Institute, whatever it might be. Rather than just expect the state to get out of the way at some point, as in the 19th century vision of a night watchman state, they believe it needs to actively be used to try and engineer the pursuit of inequality. And the pursuit of inequality needs to become the normal form of social and personal and cultural life all over again, to bring these underlying truths of inequality to life. And this is, in a sense, if you look at how universities are governed today, the point is that underneath this veneer of trade unions and notions of academic kind of solidarity and so on, there is some deep inequality struggling to get out, and all we need is for Sam Giemer and his helpful rankers and various others to simply let these inequalities come to light, and then students will be able to make their own decisions on that basis, and so will investors. Now, this project originates intellectually in the 1930s in response to Keynesianism, socialism, and social democracy, but it gets its opportunities obviously from the 1970s onwards. Now, the key point is that it's not just about markets that deliver this vision. It is also that society in general has to be reimagined as a constant competition, a constant conflict, unrelenting competitive processes. This is the broader ideology of precarity, and it's not just about markets. This is one of the things that I stress at some length in my book, The Limits of Neoliberalism, is that things like rankings, staged competitions, you could even talk of reality television, the role of sport, whatever it might be. Of course, we're not interested in sport at this conference. These are all key instruments of the reform of society around this condition of constant tussle, constant search for inequality. As Foucault and Wendy Brown explore, the individual becomes reconceived not as a labourer, as had been the condition in John Locke and Karl Marx and so on, but as human capital. And the key difference is that human capital is something that can be invested in one area of production, then rapidly withdrawn, reinvested somewhere else. It can be augmented, it can be constantly updated, upgraded, it can also deteriorate if it's not constantly tended. It can be the object of investments that pay a return over time. It is, like any other type of capital, its key feature is that it offers return on investment. So a degree now is an investment in human capital which offers some future return. This is the key feature of this as an ideology. You can also have a left-wing neoliberalism. It's worth, whenever anyone says, oh, but Blair spent a lot of money on health and education, absolutely, that doesn't mean that it wasn't redistributive. And there were plenty of quite left sympathising neoliberals over the 20th century, from people like Rougier in France and some of the ordo-liberal school in Freiburg, who believed that for this system to work, you needed quite strong safety nets so that people, to go back to my opening question, what can you still depend on if you fail? That people still had something that they could depend on if they got kind of eliminated from the economic game. They had to have something that they could depend on that would grant them the capacity to sort of, you know, to sort of reorientate themselves and then throw themselves back into the labour market. And that in some ways is the sort of brown-eyed vision of workfare as well. But I think that what this does is that rather than allowing people to live their lives as a story, life becomes a kind of risky bet, or a succession of risky bets, in search of some kind of return on investment. And in some ways, the ethos of modernity, this indeterminacy that is imagined at a collective level in notions of modernism and of enlightenment, becomes privatized. Each individual life story becomes one in which the future is uncertain. Everything is a kind of a bet on some future return that may or may not materialize. And in place of collective failure, one has individual failure. Now, in terms of actually existing neoliberalism, I think that what this means that for those outside of an extremely rich sort of oligarchical set, the consequences become deeply personal. The sense becomes that one is responsible for everything that befalls one, and there is a constant struggle for any kind of narrative coherence or to render one's life comprehensible in some way. You could say that there is a kind of a sort of bipolarity to all of this, where on the one hand we are offered the image of a kind of Jeff Bezos figure who can do anything he pleases and has complete power over whole areas of the US economy, but increasingly it looks like things like the military and all sorts of other things. Meanwhile, there is a workfare claimants who are told that they could be like that in some way, that you can do anything, that you can achieve anything if only you put your mind to it and if you believe in yourself. But that can then, of course, flip back into a sense of complete powerlessness, that one has no agency whatsoever. And what there isn't between the kind of Bezos figure and the person who has suffered a complete collapse of any feeling of agency is any sense of balance between structure and agency on which a coherent life story is dependent. And I think what is also crucial in understanding our present moment about this is that it generates a series of what the Austrian political economist Karl Polanyi called counter-movements. We start to, the key question is not how long can I sustain my engagement in this game, but also where do I go to in search of something that is dependable outside of this game? So the question is, what can I still depend on if I fail? Now, I think what's been disappointing to the left about the last 10 years or so has been that the answer that people have to that question is very often not, oh, I'll turn to my trade union or to the people or to class or something like that. But often, given the personal consequences of this style of government and economic policy, people turn to a combination of, firstly, contingent identity, so race and nation become increasingly attractive sources of permanence, forms of populism which offer tradition, offer a past that can be recovered. Before this became the game that everyone had to play, this becomes the source of security, the thing that I can depend on if I fail, that is seemingly outside of this system of precarity. Secondly, and I think one of the best books on neoliberalism that I've possibly ever read is Melinda Cooper's new Family Values, which I strongly recommend to people, which is about the role of the family, that the family was a constant presence in the background of neoliberal reforms from the 1970s onwards. And I think that, and there was a kind of an assumption running in sort of silently in the work of people like Milton Friedman and others, that once people had been sort of abandoned by various sources of security, such as the trade union and whatever else it might be, or the welfare state, that actually the family would pick people up. That was sort of the tacit assumption. This is what Cooper's book shows extremely well. And I think you can think of a couple of features in which the family is kind of reconfiguring our economy today. Firstly, the rising power of oligarchic dynasties, which is one of the key features of contemporary capitalism that doesn't get remarked on enough. I think Piketty's work on inequality has demonstrated it in terms of the power of inheritance, but Trump's, Mercer's, there will be more and more and more of these sorts of families that have the capacity to spend on a scale that used to only be possible for multinational corporations, but they tend to have private wealth, private equity. They have an autonomy that corporations have never really had. And I think we'll see much more of this over time. Secondly, the family starts to operate as a kind of potentially as a kind of prison. Children unable to move out from their parents. They would like to move out from their parents. They might like to have families of their own, but they're increasingly unable to. This is a very important feature of how austerity has harmed particularly Mediterranean Europe in the context of austerity. But equally, people unable to leave relationships that they might like to, potentially abusive relationships, becoming trapped in family relationships by the withdrawal of other forms of social support. So I think the moral crisis of neoliberalism is not just inequality, but I think it is inequality, but also the way in which it forces people to seek shelter from precarity in areas which are also culturally and emotionally unhealthy to some extent. So the ambition is to generalize precarity, but that doesn't succeed. What it does is that it pushes people to hide from precarity in other sources of social support. I need to stop in a minute, but I think that what's interesting when you look at the present moment, and you look at, say, the Labour manifesto from June 2017, is that the answer to this, and I think this is where hope lies in many ways, is the resuscitation of the idea of universality. And the idea, and I'm sure that I'll be the first person to say UBI today, but I'm sure I won't be the last, but universal basic income. But there's also ideas of universal basic services advanced by people like Henrietta Moore and Jonathan Porters, who have done this interesting work on universal basic services. There is also, if you look in the Labour manifesto, there was things like these kind of what were seen as quite populist measures about free school meals, free university tuition, this sort of thing. But the principle of universality, whether it's the question of how generous it is another matter, but I think at the very principle of universality offers a different answer to the question, what can I depend on if I fail? It may not necessarily be very much. I think the key question with UBI is how much do you get in many ways, but that psychologically and culturally, it starts to rebuild the capacity to start living coherent life stories in certain ways. And I think that if you look at the passion that people now are expressing about the National Health Service, which, I mean, that's, I've got to stop, but I think that with the NHS, I mean, we all love the NHS. I love the NHS. I think it's wonderful that the NHS has now become a sort of, untouchable phenomenon in lots of ways. But it can't be healthy as a society that so many of our expectations and hopes for empathy, collectivity, virtue, decency get channeled via the medical realm at every turn. And I think that in some ways what we're seeing with this kind of new sort of sainthood of the NHS almost, is a kind of longing for a return of a different source of social security and a different answer to that question of what can I depend on when I fail. And I think that, I think that hope lies in this resurrection of forms of universality that I think there is now a genuine appetite for, partly because of people being pushed into areas of social support and identity, whether it be kind of being locked to the family or searching for unhealthy relationships to the past in the form of nationalism and so on, that I think genuinely is something that can give us some hope. So I'm going to stop there.
Wow, can everyone see that? This is quite possibly the biggest slide I have ever seen. Fantastic. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you in particular to the New Society of Economics, the New York Economics Group, linked with PERC, and Goldsmiths University for inviting me today. It's really an honor, and I think you've done a brilliant job. I mean, manifest in the organization of the event, the kind of lead up to it, and obviously the kind of the fact that you're all here shows, I think, the genuine interest in the topics that you've highlighted, pinpointed. So I think there's a lot of interest and I think urgency to address some of the questions. And thanks very much to you, Will, for starting us off today. I think what I'm going to do is to really talk about one of the stories that you've alluded to. And when I say one, I can't actually do that, but I guess I think you can see one of the issues that we're dealing with is the collapsing of possibilities, the sort of narrowing into forms that are often not challengeable, right? So Today what I'll do is talk about questions around measurability. So I think that's very important in terms of what's considered measurable, what's not. So the quantified and the qualified comes out of a lot of my work. And also aspects of corporeality. So I'm going to bring in questions at a philosophical level to do with what these kinds of urgencies have to do with the body and the mind, as it were. You'll see what I mean in a second. But all of this within the remit of neoliberalism. Some people are talking about moving into arenas of authoritarianism. So I think the political economic questions that I've dealt with are very much around working conditions and how work is affected in this scenario. So precarity, which is in the title of the book, I brought a copy, The Quantified Self in Precarity, Work, Technology, and What Counts. So precarity itself is a form of alienation where the worker loses her personal association with the work that's performed. She's dispossessed, she's locationless in her working life, and value is extracted from her. This is a Marxist concept. She's individualized, she's disassociated from peers, and primarily and importantly from the product. And so this is all part of precarious work. So because precarious workers are in this kind of context dispossessed and disconnected, we are constantly chasing the next gig, right? So there's a spatial and temporal context to this. And any memory of consistency that we might have talked about in terms of modernity are largely out of reach. So in that context, what can be measured becomes important. So precarity is symptomatic of the fall in wage share, value added, as Fordism gave way to financialized accumulation, to the rise in self-employment, to the fall of the dot-com bubble, to repeated global economic crises. And the thing that I'm interested in is digitalization. This has to do with automation. This has to do with computerization. This has to do with tracking, monitoring, and other forms that have reached the factory, are evident within the office space now, increasingly, as well as warehouse work, as well as on the streets. So my work has addressed this. So anyway, today most workers, in fact, experience a form of precarity. Now, severely weakened job contracts, over-indebtedness, austerity, the rolling back of the welfare state exacerbate these situations, are the context within which this happens. Now there's evidence of the worst forms in already hyper-exploited arenas of work. So in the introduction of the book, I outline the rise of these kinds of work, the empirical evidence for where this is happening, where, for example, in the UK, statistics in 2016 and 17 show that the rise in national employment figures, which was very celebrated by the government, in fact relied on self-employment. So in the UK alone, more than 900,300 people worked in 0 hours contracts in 2016, which is a number that rose from 747,000 by 20% in 2016 alone. So insecure work is on the rise, increased by 27% from 2011 as of the time of writing for the book in early 2017, and is evidenced in and leads to the following experiences whereby wages can fluctuate without warning, workers have access to fewer rights, are forced into an antagonistic employment relationship of self-defense, whereby if there are rights, one is forced really to sort of claim those to the employer, where in the first instance that's not happening. Often self-employment is a forced condition. This is bogus self-employment. This is extremely evident in, for example, gig work. So workers in precarity often miss out on basic rights, key protections like sick pay, holiday pay, and a basic work contract, like I mentioned, with the kinds of protections you'd expect if you are classified as an actual employee. So the type of work often means that people are positioned at the very, very blatant and frankly vulgar mercy of the bosses. Now, this becomes paradoxical when, in fact, in some cases, the boss is removed. So the algorithmic boss, as it were. So there are about 80 million people, and I'll give you the context, for example, of crowd work, which is covered in one of the chapters. There are 80 million people working in the supposed sharing economy, also called crowd work, called the gig economy, called platform work, with nuances in meanings across these categories. So in the USA and 23 million in the UK from 2016 to 17. So that's a relatively large number. So while the ventures that people are working within started as grassroots startups, they've scaled upwards. And the movement is led by global corporations backed by venture capital, including such megaliths as Airbnb, Uber, and these kinds of mega rich companies. Although, amusingly, they're not often making much profit. Anyway, so revenues from this sharing economy across Europe are projected to exceed 80 billion euros and facilitate 570 billion euros by 2025. So it's seen as quite a big market. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in that arena, but it is one of the areas where, in fact, I argue informal and non-standard work, which already existed as categories, are in particular being used for the labor market aspects. That's actually coming out of the International Labour Organization report that's been published and was taken to the International Labour Conference recently in Geneva, the threat of physical and psychosocial violence and harassment in digitalized work. Now, what this report does is to go through where you're finding increases in digitalized work, in particular in management practices that are put into place. So anyway, just to say the early enthusiasm for the kind of sharing economy, now we're looking at the kind of Uberized working conditions, as this has been called, obscures, in fact, workers' experiences, which are fueling these mega corporations, these multinational enterprises, platform-based multinational enterprises, as I've called them. So there's an exacerbation of precarity, which was already on the rise in these kinds of post-fordist arenas, where we find that the precariat, frankly, cannot be understood under conventionally viewed or the more modernist standards of living, where we see precarity as an epical, in fact, recomposition of capital and labor, as Brophy and Teeter have talked about it, which uses disposability of workers to resubordinate us. Yeah, that's talked about in Bourdieu's work, Laurie's work, Federici talks about this, and it's often contrasted in literature too, in fact, Fordism. Okay, so let's see. My argument is, okay, so I put a bunch of pictures of the types of work that I've been talking about. My argument is that in gig work and other digitalized work, precarity has not led, as it says on the tin, to happiness and fulfillment, but to underemployment, anxiety, sickness, risks of violence and harassment, as is outlined in the report. So a form of digitalized precarity, as it were, and other forms of digitalized work. And the book argues that, in fact, more to get into this into the philosophical context, the corporeal colonization of precarity, and in fact something we're talking about as unseen labor, is in fact endemic in the management techniques that have begun to use technologies in new ways. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the forms of management methods as they are. I've called them digitalized management methods. I've also looked at a platform management model to identify precisely what kinds of management practices are allowing these factors to happen. Okay, and why this is important is that there's a kind of black box around supposedly how algorithmic decision making proceeds. So if we can't understand it, then potentially it races ahead without sort of any kind of form of regulation or recognition. So it's trying to tease out what the actual empirical, how it actually looks. So, for example, we've got self-archiving, self and other tracking devices in the platform work in the kind of context I've already talked about. So this made me really want to think, before I started writing this book, to interrogate assumptions of, in fact, the ontology for the mind-body experience. Now, you'll see here the quantified self. Now, this is a movement that started in California, in Silicon Valley context, where the search for the otherwise unknowable self was really, it became very popular. People began to use, in fact, sensory technologies to identify the autonomic self, the self that is otherwise not knowable. So there was a kind of movement around this of excitement, whereby if you actually can find patterns in, let's say, your sleep or your steps or all these other things, you can make links to your emotional health and well-being. So what does that mean when that enters the workplace? So I've identified a literature in a recent paper called Quantified Work. It's kind of collapsed in terms of the format, but you can see the point: self and other tracking through big data. The quote there is actually from an interview I did with a clandestine interview with a warehouse worker. Again, there's a real corporeal aspect to this, in the sense of the physically we just can't do anymore. So there's there's a sense that the use of the kinds of technologies, whether it's an armband in the factory or it's something embedded in your computer called rescue time to sort of give you tailored identification of your own productivity through time spent on your computer terminal or clicks in these things in terms of how much you type, so composition or communications, that in fact this collapses what can be measured, what can be identified as important. So the qualified is left out of those questions. Now, I've done this in different ways. I've talked about how that potentially leads to discrimination, potentially leads to, in fact, and has done, I argue, sickness, anxiety, and other things. You can find in the labor force survey a real increase in musculoskeletal issues and also stress and anxiety as reasons for not attending, for absences at work. Okay. Now, I don't want to take too much time on, but I've also sort of put here in the talk that the 2010 book that I've done previously, so I really looked at in the employability agenda. So this is all based in work that I've become interested in terms of what is employability, what can it mean. I'm talking about something called hireability, because in the kind of gig work context, the instant taking of a very short-term job, I think Bezos talks about this as, it's the best job design in the world because you can hire and train and fire someone within the course of 15 minutes, is this kind of stuff. So, I mean, this this hyper precarity is exacerbated through digitalization, but I know you want to hear about the more philosophical aspects, so I'm going to jump to that. Okay, so the chapter following the introduction positions the book's arguments. So I talk about this in terms of the new materialist literature, where ontological questions, that the provocations that I'm putting in terms of the research questions I pose are primary, where the terrain of workers' struggle begins with a fervency of corporeality in the face of quantification and digitalized labor. Okay, so what I tried to do is set a framework for critical political economy of precarious quantified work. In fact, what I do is I look at two turns in literature. They're called the corporeal turns and the affective turn, which informed the emergence of new materialisms. So these renewed debates in materialism really emerged in both feminist post-structuralist and also Marxist circles. So there are two camps that started to talk about something called new materialism. Okay, so in around 2009. So I became interested, in fact, ran a seminar series to look at what was meant philosophically, why these two arenas are emerging and why they had this same title. And then for me, what does that mean in terms of digitalization of work? So the material that feminist new materialist researchers identify is based on a monist ontology, which this clashes, in fact, I argue, with an orthodox Marxist binary, the kind of mainstream political economy research where there's a Cartesian reliance on Cartesian binaries, okay? Just to sort of give it to you in relatively straightforward terms. So, but what I tried to do is to look for traces of coherence across the types of questions that they were asking and put that into the context of our contemporary moment of neoliberalism. To say, in fact, there is a corporeal dimension to the kinds of questions you're asking, and can there be something that we can find within critical political economy that benefits from the radical new materialism that ties the kinds of loose ends across disciplines for a better understanding to, in fact, do what I would argue both camps would like to do, which is to reveal the exploitative aspects of the kinds, in the context, let's say, of management practices and of working conditions in the employment relationship, to inspire discussions around resistance and emancipation. Okay, so in terms of why digitalized working, why these practices have become interesting for management. So I wrote about it in I think Kees van der Pijl's anthology on international political economy, where I start to argue that, in fact, the types of management practices don't necessarily overlook the corporeal dimension. I would argue there's a shift in management practices that, in fact, understands that there is a monism, that there is a corporeal dimension, that, in fact, I mean, if you look at sort of wellness initiatives, in fact, the mind and the body are both supposedly now addressed, right, in the way that your maybe job contract and then the kind of the related benefits or the related features are laid out, that in fact you are expected to associate your work and your well-being in the same kind of remit. But now, even as far back as industrial betterment, which comes before scientific management, there was a recognition of, in fact, a spiritual well-being, right? So you were told you should actually be involved with your family, you should be at church, you should abstain from drinking, and generally behave in upright ways. So mental and spiritual wellness and physical wellness, also part of a long history. However, I'm arguing that the way that digitalization proceeds now is that there are ways of identifying what that is, measuring and tracking what that is, and then also managed and controlled. Even, well, for example, and I write about it in the book, so China introduced radio calisthenics as part of a drive for a healthy population. This was picked up by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. But typically, workers' actions were assessed for precision then, later in scientific management. But still, the corporeal aspect is that it was the way that the body moved when one was building a wall with bricks. So it was seen that there could be a one best way. So there was a corporeal dimension to how the body moved, but there weren't the technologies to sort of identify that and track it and then potentially put that into appraisal contexts, disciplinaries and things like this. So it was there and understood in this guru-like way. So outward behaviors were measurable through earlier forms of cameras, a microchronometer and so on, and scientifically analyzed. Actually, I've put here something that happened, and this is kind of why it would be interesting to have Guy standing here as well. I understand he can't be here. However, he was a part of the International Labour Organization for a long time. Now, this is the League of Nations, and in 1926, they actually had a conference. This is some archival research that's also in the book, whereby they looked at scientific management as a way of, in fact, civilizing the world. Across Europe, there were lots and lots of research centers set up to identify this as a really positive way. We're going to find prosperity through scientific management. And ultimately, it really related to not just the worker. In fact, it's I don't know if you know this, but it's a dogma that also entered the way that banking was set up. Banks were set up, the way that agriculture was organized, and more than just about work itself. But anyway, that's just something if you want to read the book. But the point for me to talk about now is that more recently, while you had, in fact, the workers' internal goings-on and emotions and the well-being aspect were somewhat still mysterious. Now, there were attempts to measure these in a way, and also the Galbraiths looked at fatigue, and there was a Harvard fatigue laboratory set up, in fact, during human relations, which is later. So I talk about the whole history of work design in the book. But to sort of identify, and Will Davies has written quite a lot in terms of behaviorism and how that becomes a science and understood as something that can be looked at with a more scientific veneer. But really attempts to penetrate a level of sub or unconsciousness for specific purposes then in the 1950s is called the depth approach, looked more with consumerism, and then it became later accepted wisdom that people could be nudged right into behaving differently. So that's something already that came up in Will's talk as well. You have the behavioral insights team that was set up, let's just fast forward through history, in 2011. So this group of civil servants was assigned the task of altering the perceptions of people. And to help them identify that their choices are aligned with the types of strategies that this insight team took to put together, which should lead people to make the best option easier. Okay, so this should lead to making the best option for choices easier to make, right? So what I'm interested in is when nudge in this context is used more in the workplace, where attempts to promote behavior that'll lead to physical health and internal happiness are quite common. Now, bearing in mind this tends to happen more in the office space than the factory, where intensified and intimate tracking has been almost expected. There is a class dimension to this as well. I've put a list of what is quantified work in the way I talk about it. How many minutes do I have? 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes, fantastic, okay. So just to give you a concept around the kind of context around how I understand quantified work. Quantified workers, again, sought in the dirty, dark, dangerous workplace. Maybe this has become more expected. However, you are finding, and let me give you some context from the interviews. I put one of the interviews up earlier. So armbands are now being used. You'll have heard of Amazon, who've recently patented a haptic feedback finger scanner type armband, whereby you will be nudged, in fact, to move your arm in the right direction, and you'll be told if you're not doing that. Now, again, my question becomes, and if we are seeing these types of practices in the factory, in the streets, where, for example, Uber drivers can be deactivated if they are not accepting enough jobs. So the algorithmic decision making, as well as feedback from customers, as well as the use now of AI, which is seen as a brilliant new way of organizing workplaces. So this is people analytics in the office space. So this is hiring, firing, making predictions about talent based on the data that's accumulated, big data that's been accumulated over time. Now AI is taking into this brilliant new world where decisions can be made much more accurately without any possibility for bias, of course, because the qualitative has judgments that one makes based on based on other things, based on a judgment, whereas numbers, of course, don't lie. And I'm saying this provocatively, of course, for you to take away message. Is there any possibility for resistance and fighting back? So ultimately, in the context of various forms of digitalization, which is exacerbating already existing precarious conditions, I'm just going to leave you with a quote to think about from Chris Dancy, in fact, the most connected man on the planet, as he was called, a cyborg. If you can measure it, someone will, and that someone should be you. Just something to think about. Okay, thanks.
Okay, well that was brilliant, and really, especially going into how the digital and technology might be, what kind of role that is playing in this, which I found quite confusing before. So that's great. So we're going to have questions now, and we've got to have roving mics somewhere. 2 of them? One of them? One of them. So yes, have we got any questions? Okay, is that okay if we take 3, Will and Phoebe, take about 3, depending on how long they are. So first one there. Anyone else? And okay, we'll start with those 2. Maybe. Yeah, you could just shout. I need to go on. Bottom button and then.
Okay, thank you. Balihar Sangera from University of Kent. I really enjoyed both presentations. I suppose my comment relates to both, but specifically to Will. I suppose I was, I think I agreed with much of your analysis, but I was a bit confused on one aspect. I understand precarity is about people's inability to contribute, to find work which they are particularly apt to do, or struggle to find work which they're particularly apt to do. So one think about, highly qualified graduates who can't find work that matches their skills and then having to work as, shop assistants. What I couldn't then relate to was how your solution, or part of your solution to that is something like redistribution of wealth, or something like the universal income scheme. How that specifically addresses the issue of people's inability to find appropriate work. Because surely, if that's the problem of precarity, then surely part of the solution would be about how to reshape the division of labour, specifically how to ensure job sharing, how to ensure that people who are like us, or like yourselves, in full-time, very privileged jobs, should be able to share that with people who are newly PhDs, who are struggling to get a foothold into academia, unable to do so, and having to go from one temporary contract to another temporary contract, doing, poorly paid, overly laborious seminar teaching, when they really want to do lecturing, when they really want to have secure permanent job. But that can't be done if the division of labour is such that it allows people like us to secure jobs, and those who can't having to just to search. So surely, finish my point. Surely the issue is about division of labour.
Okay, thanks. Lucia.
Steve Taylor, I'm a MRes student at University of East London. I wonder if you're potentially underplaying the class dimensions of this. Because if you think about, if you connect this with David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs, and the kind of work that he describes there, which is almost like the polar opposite of the Amazon type situation, where people are virtually doing nothing and having to sort of somehow create the semblance of work, but actually they're being quite well paid, a lot of them, for really being profoundly unproductive. So I wonder, I just wonder about that. It seems such a polarized situation. I wonder if this is almost like a reframing of class, labour relations in class.
Thank you.
Thank you for both the questions, and the first one is, I think spot on. I mean, to be honest, partly for reasons beyond our control, I'm here on a panel which is ostensibly about labour markets, but I don't work on labour markets. So I wasn't. My take on precarity was more about a sort of a broader malaise of insecurity and of the demand to be constantly adaptable in all sorts of walks of life, not just in the workplace. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's a really important contribution in terms of us thinking this new economic futures, and I hadn't really thought about it quite like that. I think you're absolutely right, that in a way what I was trying to get at is that some of the injustices of all of this are not simply about who suffers, but I suppose also the sorts of kind of reactive behaviours, the counter movements of where we go to protect ourselves from all this sort of stuff. And it is true, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, but it's true that those who have a secure academic job have sort of got into the castle, and the drawbridges sort of has been going up in recent years. You're absolutely right. Now, and so the question is, what can we do to sort of lower those walls and to sort of allow greater sort of intermingling across them? I mean, I suppose the problem is, and you saw this around the mobilisation of the USS strikes in February and March, is that tenured academics sort of very happy with solidarity, but it's sort of there were as you probably know, there were a lot of early career researchers and PhD students who were quite unhappy with those strikes, because it was a lot of sort of, we're all right, Jack. Well, we're not all right, but we're looking after our pensions on top of our secure employment situations. So the problem is that, of course, that the kind of left-leaning academic, those with academic privileges and security, and I'm fortunate to be in that camp, as you say, look at government reforms and just think all they want to do is spread further precarity. They want to shake up these places with Andrew Adonis wants us to sort of lose any semblance of sort of non-monetized, non-measured time, and to have to kind of account for ourselves at every single moment. And I'm sure that people like Anthony Seldon pushing for kind of 2-year degrees want something similar. But you're absolutely right. Of course, the question is, what is there beyond this sort of what the economists would characterise as kind of rent-seeking behaviour on our part, which is that basically we want to protect our capacity to earn income from competition, effectively, versus just more and more precarity and more competition. The idea of something like a job share, I think, is a really interesting issue, and I think it sounds like you've probably thought about this a bit more than I have. So I just welcome the contribution, but I wasn't trying to suggest that something like a UBI would address some of these sorts of things. So
yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. So it occurred to me that, in fact, I didn't get a chance to talk about where precarity originates. This is part of, in fact, the autonomia movement in Italy in the sort of 60s, 70s. And in fact, what they were looking at, I'm going to challenge the idea of work at all. So they were linked to the workerist movement, who were saying, why work? Why actually work? Because we're in a position whereby, again, everything is determined for one when one enters the employment relationship. And so it's more of a liberatory movement. There was a sense of emancipation that could potentially come from, in fact, simply just saying no. And so when we talk about how to divide labor, of course, the way the precarity has been written about, for example, by Guy Standing and by subsequent groups, has been a little bit different, in fact, from how it originated with the workerist movement and with autonomia. So I think it's interesting to reflect on that. Also, just to sort of give you the anecdote, that San Precario still is at the Euro May Day sort of events, and this is often a transgender effigy that sort of highlights the potentials, again, for emancipation with solidarity and with, in fact, take back control. Anyway, okay, so then the next point that occurred to me as you were talking is that, in fact, when we talk about productivity and bullshit jobs, for example, what is unproductive labor, I would actually challenge the concept of productivity too, right? So I'm challenging both. I'm challenging work, I'm challenging productivity. I think it's important to do that, to reflect upon that, because, and my research has done that, to say, so what is considered productive then changes, because performance and the recognition of what is good performance changes too. So in fact, what is being measured, so a paper that's just coming out in Body and Society, what I'm arguing, in fact, is that again, historically, there hasn't been as much, let's say, interpretation of possibility of measuring, for example, affective labor, emotional labor. So these are areas that are these productive or not? So I think that over time they've been considered unproductive. So you have a social reproduction question. So a lot of women's work completely overlooked, unseen work, okay, and in fact something that does in fact fuel the capitalist machine, definitely. So now I'm beginning to spot that in fact there are attempts to try and identify and measure it in ways, again, put together very much by management teams. But why? Is it to pay for it, or is it to predict collapse? So I'm arguing, in fact, and that's the corporeal dimension again, because you know it's the bottom line. If we lose workers, if they're calling in sick more often, they tell us they're anxious, so on and so forth. Has that anything to do with their working conditions and with their job description? No, it's their fault. It's responsibilization, of course. It's it's accountability, again, placed individualization. That's all a part of neoliberalism, and the way that it's theorized as well. Okay.
More questions. Jonna, we'll have Jonna, and then you, and then there was another one not there. Okay, and then you in the pink.
My question's about boundaries, because I think it's quite interesting in terms of like when we're talking about political economy as this way of envisioning, and we're mobilizing new economic futures as a kind of set of concepts that allows us to move beyond kind of economistic understandings of capitalism, basically. So if the boundaries around, drawing again on Melinda Cooper's work, whose book I've just started, so I'm not going to claim to know everything that it says, but I thought was interesting there's her idea that we can't take as kind of given social reproduction, or the kind of the role of the family in, providing what is necessary. We cannot go to work. We cannot go to university. A lot, as I know with 3 children, work goes into just getting you that far. So we need to sustain ourselves. We need to reproduce ourselves. There's all kinds of things that happen before we enter and cross that boundary into formal work, or into, so precarity spills across boundaries. And I just thought, to invite you to explain some of the ways in which precarity or inequality is not just what exists within the market, but is one that is socialized wider, and how political economy allows us to locate it in order to act against.
Excellent, thank you. In the blue. Left, back. Okay, we'll take the pink. Just on the right there.
Thank you. Olivia Hamlin, University of Leicester. Quite an abstract question. I'm just wondering what concept of the human underpins some of these sort of neoliberal principles and systems and institutions that you've been talking about. Are we seen as machines? Are we animals? I mean, what kind of creatures are we in this world?
Great. And then put your hand up. There you go.
Thank you. Mary Hodgson, working with the LSE. My question's about resistance, and it's for Phoebe, particularly because I was really excited about what you were saying, Phoebe, in terms of the way that you're excited about a horror movie that's apocalypse that's rushing towards you. And particularly in terms of what people can do, what workers can do to resist or make change, especially given the context of this conference. I'm currently working in an industrial town that's seen a lot of rapid industrial diversification. It's got one of the highest rates of debt and addiction in the country. People who live there say that they can't get any work because they are seen to be too problematic for agencies and the factories that employ them. And within those contexts, when resistance will seem really dangerous or just impossible, you sort of hinted at the end what could be done. And I just wondered if you had sort of any more thoughts about how workers resist and how they sort of talk to you about how they can resist and what happens when they do. And also, if it's not too cheeky, to ask what you think might happen in within the next 10 years in terms of those trends that you're talking about.
Yeah, good question.
I can try to keep it short. Let me just make sure I've got all these. These are huge questions. Okay, let me just do them in the reverse order. Partly because I can say in terms of resistance, absolutely, and thank you for your question. Obviously, there's context, I think, there there's the implication. So, okay, so resistance. So, okay, in this report, the final section looks at formal responses. So that's trade union responses. So finally, the international sort of community is interested in what's happening here. Thus, in fact, this report being commissioned, as it were. And that for me is encouraging. So I've gone through, so the German trade unions have been very active. So you have IG Metall, you have Verdi, and there are also new forms of organizing that don't always take the traditional trade union banners. So that's, for example, FAU Berlin. So they're kind of anarchist group. So you have in Britain, you have the IWGB. So there were kinds of responses to do with organizing, I think, are encouraging. So that's something to keep an eye on and sort of outlined here. I've also looked at more informal forms of resistance. So these linked with feet dragging. You can see these in call center work, for example. You see leveraging. You see, in fact, opting out. There are problems with the concept of opting out. And I did a project alongside workers over the course of a year in the Netherlands whereby they were kitted out with self-monitoring and tracking devices. Formally, they were allowed to opt in or opt out. So in the course of the interviews over the year, so it turned out, in fact, around 75% of people simply stopped using the devices. So that's kind of switch off, right? So, but the question then becomes: is there ever a consensual relationship between the employer and the employee, the worker and the client, and all these the new employment relationships and the work design context that we're talking about, scenarios. So I think there are a lot of questions being asked, and so what can be done? We can talk a lot about that because again, you've highlighted the sort of disposability. So people feel like, right, if I don't buy into this or I don't allow it to happen, then there are many people who can replace that work. So that's quite difficult. And I think unions are fortunately beginning to respond. There are also questions around data and the use of your data. The GDPR that was rolled out 25th of May does actually have very strong resonance for workers and in public sector as well as private. So you need to be you need to be told if your data is being gathered and why, and what it's going to be used for when it's collected and so on. So that might be a positive form of regulation in terms of possibilities. And then finally, there are two other questions. The social reproduction. I'm going to send you the Body and Society paper, Jonna. This probably doesn't address your question, but absolutely correct that there are all sorts of things that are outside of technically what's being measured and understood as productive and work and these things, and those have to be dealt with and looked at. And I'm concerned, and this also links with the 10 years question, that if there is a capture and identification and of that, it'll still be done within specific parameters. So again, what's left out counts just as much. Miriam Cherry writes a little bit about this as well. What's not tracked is just as important as what is, and that's there's a history of what's measured, what's not, and that's to do with social reproduction very clearly. Concept of the human question, and Lester, colleague, great. Let's talk about that a little more. I forgot to read one of the points from here. Key questions that bring me to my philosophical question. Apparently I didn't mention this. Are we engaging with machines, adapting to machines, being subordinated through the automation, both of work and management, where the role of technology is so significant, we're looking at an imminent scenario where the relationship is inverse and in fact machines manage humans. That's the kind of stuff that I've kind of addressed in my work. A couple of times I've said, and it could lead to possibilities for resistance, because if the manager is invisible, what's to say that we don't just become collective? It should help with solidarity, it should help in fact, and I think collaborative working environment spaces that were envisioned with the peer-to-peer production, I used to write about that, where supposedly democratization of the workplace, we are managing ourselves. The question links to your social reproduction question, which is self-management. Right, again, so it can be put in two frames. Is it something that's necessarily liberating, emancipating, or is it something that's put in, that means there's unpaid work that goes into something that, of course, is a surplus value in the end? Yeah. So.
I'll try and be as quick as I can, because the question of boundaries. This is something which I know you thought and written about at some length, John, and clearly the issue of the family, although Melinda Cooper's book is wonderful on it, is not news to feminist economists or political economists. That this is a site of this is an area where questions of inequality and labour and so on are just as pertinent as in the market. But I think what's interesting about what's the state of neoliberalism, particularly post 2008, is that it's bringing that issue. It will increasingly bring that to light in ways that, just as one small example, so you have all of these disputes about student fees and student debt, but there must be loads of students out there who went to private school whose parents are paying these fees. Equally, this bank of mum and dad phenomenon that gets written about in the papers the whole time and so on, there are all sorts of inequalities and power dynamics and economic questions that are being threaded through the family, but which, because the media is still obsessed with markets, are not really able to kind of make sense of in some way. So they have to talk about banks of mum and dad, whereas they're not a bank, they're mum and dad, So there's this sort of inability to actually, as you say, it's about boundaries, about how do we make sense of the relationship between the family and the market. On the question of the human, I think there are two answers here which are sort of jostle for position. One is the human is an asset, which is the sort of, the Gary Becker view, which is that you are something that is born into the world and earns a certain income over the course of your existence, and you can be kind of cuddled or held or educated or given plastic surgery or whatever it might be, so as to alter that income over a lifespan. But then there's the cybernetic answer, or the Darwinian answer, which is that you are a piece of code. And that's in a sense, this is where it kind of links back to the question of digital surveillance, which is that every human being is a kind of bundle of symbols and codes, who is in some sense at war with other codes and symbols, as in the Darwinian Jordan Peterson sort of view of the world, and that the marketplace is one which will kind of decide which codes win and which codes get eliminated. So I think there's a sort of a financial answer and a cybernetic answer, and those are the sort of two dominant ones in the history of a neoliberal thought at any rate.
Great. Okay, I think we've only got time for one question, one very quick question. No? Yes, one there.
It'll be very quick.
Yeah.
It's to Phoebe, really, that seems to me, I'm a senior fellow of mental health policy at the University of Birmingham. I'm really concerned about the increasing use of AI in psychiatry and in mental health. There's usually some shady off-grid institute involved with this research institute. I wondered if you had any views on the work of the Alan Turing Institute, which is having tons of cash poured into it, and one of its remits is to revolutionise healthcare, including economic benefits and efficiencies for the government and society.
Okay. Just 2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I can just use it as a chance to talk about AI a little bit. Part of a project that I'll be doing for the EU over the next few months. So I have to deal with a lot of these. And also the question of psychosocial here, there's recognition that the use of AI, for me, human resources, so management, decision-making, management methods, and the way that new algorithmically informed business model is being experimented with. And it's not just the Turing Institute, there's a lot of money being poured into this with a lot of enthusiasm. Now, AI itself, why it's kind of hit the headlines is because companies have been accumulating big data over many years now, so everybody's been very excited, big data, big data, big data. Now we have the capacity to use that big data to train AI. Yeah, that's the experimentation. So if we can get AI to make these decisions for us, just to put it into sort of simplistic terms, then what could it possibly do positively? So for me, it's only about work. I haven't looked at the health dimensions. Ruth Kane is here, so you'll be probably talking about that a little bit more later in terms of the health dimensions and mental health especially. It's not something exactly that I've written about. However, the threats of physical and psychosocial violence, which I talk about in the structural way as well as physical and emotional violence ways, that there is emerging evidence that to create business models and especially work design models that rely on, in fact, yes, codes that rely on the generation of data from the patterns that emerges over time, that in fact statisticians could technically do with a lot of time on their hands. However, it is also the case that algorithms and the kinds of equations that are allegedly programmed do also come up with results that couldn't have necessarily been predicted, and also may not be the same that a human would come up with. Now, I just think I would just sort of alert caution that we need to not put a black box around these things and go into the hidden abode, which is the Marxist term. Let's go into the hidden abode where we can reveal what the capitalist is up to. That's the name of another paper. Okay, all right.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was amazing.